Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris. This is Model Airplane Maker, and this is the first of a series of videos for a Tamiya Tomcat build. In this first video, we're going to go through steps 1 through 8, and we're going to focus on out-of-box techniques to really bring out the detail of your cockpit and to take your breath away. Oh God, that's bad. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. While you see my hands busy snipping parts off the sprues, I'll take a second to explain what these videos are all about. It will be the first of a series of short build sequence videos for the construction and finish of the Tamiya F-14A Tomcat in 48 scale. This will be an out-of-box build, so no aftermarket goodies, except I will bring in some aftermarket decals at the end of the build. This video is made up of steps 1 through 8 that you'd find in the Tamiya instructions. So at the end of these steps, you'll have a completed nose section of the aircraft, but the meat really is the cockpit. So I'm going to show you some techniques to make painting jet era cockpits easier and to get the detail to pop without having to use a lot of aftermarket bits, resin, photo etch, that sort of thing. While this build progresses, I'll show you what I use in terms of paints and washes, but there are a variety of products out there for you to use, so certainly don't feel like this is the only way to do it. You'll notice that I'm snipping off all the parts for steps 1 through 8, and this is so I can paint all the light colored parts together. There's an incredible amount of parts that are all painted the same color, and this saves me time from having to clean the airbrush between painting parts. And sometimes, depending on the complexity or the similarity of the parts, I actually label the holders, or at least the parts, so that I can keep track of it, but in this case I didn't have to do that. The gray that's used, and I'll put all of the colors in the parts, in the description of the video, but the gray was XF19 Sky Gray. All the black that they call for semi-gloss black, but I use a mixture of 50-50 Nato black to gloss black, and for the white I use gloss white, but we'll get to painting later on in the video, just in a minute. You'll also notice that I'm using side nippers. In this case, and if I don't pronounce it right, sorry, but they're Dispe side nippers. I also have a pair of Tamiya ones. And the reason why I'm using them is that it just makes parts clean up that much faster. So after I snipped all these parts, I only had to go over, I'd say half of them with just maybe a swipe or two of the sanding stick just to get them all prepared for paint. I won't show you the airbrushing of the gray. 2 reasons. 1 being it's not that exciting, but 2, you can't even really see the base gray being put on these parts because, of course, the part's plastic itself is gray. All right, so at this point, all of your cockpit parts are painted in sky gray. And what we're going to be doing now is masking off certain sections of the instrument panel and the side panels. As you'll see on these parts and in the instructions, there are squares or sections of either the instrument panel, the main thing in the front of the pilot and instruments officer, or on the sides of the cockpit that have black squares. And how I'm going to paint those is I will use masking tape to mask the gray areas so I can paint the black. Now this might appear to be quite tedious to cut small pieces of Tamiya tape and place them very carefully like this, but the tediousness and your perseverance with it will be rewarded. And why I say that is that we're going to mask off these sections, we're going to paint them black, but then this masking is going to help us with the next step of the process, which is to highlight each one of these buttons without worrying about painting over the base coat of your parts. Again, having to place these very small pieces of tape does seem to be like a tremendous amount of work for what that thing is. You might want to just simply paint it by hand with a brush. And if you're very steady with your hand, you can well, you'd probably do just as good a job as anything. But for me, I don't have that steady of a hand to paint those precise areas, so it's actually easier for me to mask and paint, despite the fact that it does take a while to do. So if you're gonna spend an evening masking like this, having some scale model content playing in the background or the game or music really helps. So here are the parts that are prepared, and I'm about to use some dry brushing. For that I use Citadel acrylic paints, and these things I find are just fantastic to do dry brushing with, because you can just have the smallest amount of paint on your brush and really lightly go over the parts to highlight all of the dials and knobs and switches that exist. Recently, dry brushing has gotten a bit of a it's not seen as quite the amazing thing that it once was, and I think it's unfortunate because, and I understand why some people don't like the technique anymore. But in this case, if you lightly go over the part, what I'm trying to do here is really have all those knobs and switches pop so that I can go over this part later on with a fine tipped brush and be able to really see each one of these items that I'm going to paint. So the dry brushing technique is fairly simple. Take almost all, and I mean almost all, of the paint off the brush, and you don't even want to push the brush across the part as you're doing this. And for some reason, working at an angle, like going crisscross as opposed to up and down or side to side, for whatever reason, this seems to work a lot better with getting just the right amount of dry brushing or highlighting on each one of these parts. And like I said before, you're going to want to keep that masking on just in case, tiny case, that you might have made a mistake and kept too much paint on your brush as you are doing dry brushing. And you just, one part at a time. Don't go overboard, because later on in the build you are going to, or I'm going to show you that I'm going to take a small brush and I'm going to touch each one of those dials to really make it pop. This is to help that process out in advance. Once you're done putting this dry brushing on all of the black components of the cockpit, you can take the masks off, and then what I do is I give a clear coat, gloss clear coat, over each one of these components. And that's going to help in the next step, where we are going to use a wash to highlight those panel lines that are between each one of these black panels. And the last bit here is the dry brushing of the instrument panel, which you're going to have to be a bit creative because it's not a flat piece. So as you can see, I'm having a little bit of trouble trying to do a light coat of dry brushing while hitting all the right spots. So the next step is to use a panel line wash. In this case, it's Mig Ammo. This one's the Nature Effects, but you can also use a gray panel line wash. I just didn't have any for this video. And over your glossed component, you simply take a small brush, you load it up with the panel line wash, and you just touch the areas that are between each one of these panels, and you let the wash flow by capillary action. If there is a mistake made, like say if you had a little bit too much and you actually got some of the gray on the panel itself, not to worry, because you've glossed it, you can go over this in about 40 minutes or so, 30-40 minutes, with a cotton bud or even with a paintbrush, and you can wipe that mistake off to get those nice crisp black panels done. This doesn't take very long. You shake up the bottle, you take your brush, give it some paint, some wash, and you just touch where you need the wash to go, and let capillary action do the rest for you. On the instrument panel, once you remove the masks, you're going to see that some of the instruments aren't absolutely perfectly square, and there's also some round instruments that might have been painted like a square around where it's supposed to be circular. And what you can use is the same panel line wash, and essentially you're kind of using it as a paint to flood the area just a bit so that the paint goes all the way around the instruments. If you made a mistake like I have here, you just need to take your brush, put a little bit of thinner on it, and you're just going to clean up where some of these mistakes were made, so you can get a nice clear black part that's supposed to be on its own on the gray panel. Okay, and the last step is take a thin brush, probably the smallest brush you have, mix up a mix of gray and white, maybe 50-50 of Tamiya acrylic paint, and you're just going to go along and you're going to touch each one of the dials or knobs in order to highlight it. And this is where that dry brushing will really help out, because you can see it after the dry brushing, but now you're really going to pop it out. If you use a reference like I did, you'll notice that there are various buttons or switches that are different colors, and in this case there's red, there's white, there's yellow. So if you have a photographic reference, in my case I think that I found another build online, and I just saw what that builder used to paint various knobs and switches in the cockpit. They're very clear pictures, and I just followed that. There are a few decals to put in the cockpit, and there again, that's why if you do a gloss on these parts, the decal will go on a lot easier for you and stay and behave and sink into where it's supposed to go. The F-14 had some very unique aspects in the cockpit, and one of them is this fabric coating or fabric topping of the backs of the instrument panels. And the color, I don't know what, I mean, it looks fabric to me. The instructions for the Tamiya kit call for a khaki color, but if you just paint it that way, it just looks brown. So to try and replicate the fabric effect, I painted it black, and in this case I'm giving it an extremely over-the-top dry brushing of white. This is not how you would normally dry brush a part. This is to really exaggerate the raised portions from the recesses in order to really make it look like fabric once you paint it with Tamiya buff. You should go over this. I went over this about 3-4 times to get that very gray, black, and white effect. There are 3 parts of the cockpit that are like this. The top combing covers, I guess you'd call them, come later on in the build, but because on the side of one of the instrument panels there is this fabric fabric coating or topping, I decided to do it all at once, so at least there'd be some uniformity to the fabric in the cockpit. So again, I'm just doing a very heavy dry brush of white over the black. So when it comes to spraying the khaki, I made it very thin, almost, I'd say 50% paint to 50% thinner, or even more thinner than that. And what I want to do when I'm spraying fabric like this is to do this in very light coats, because I don't want to obliterate all of that dry brushing that I did on these parts. So I'll give it, a coating, set that part down, get the next one, give that a coating, set that part down. And this way I'm just going to build up that color slowly, so that by the end you're going to have a nice textured pattern of fabric. I will note that the one fabric cover that goes over the back part of the cockpit looks a lot more fabricy, if you will, than the one that goes over the front. And just take your time with this. If it seems that you're doing too much, just put it down, get the next part. And the reason why I'm doing them together, like I said, is to get some uniformity, because once the cockpit's all together and the three parts are relatively close together, you're going to see that they're all about the same shades of khaki. After the khaki's been done and all of the paint on the side panels and instrument panels is dry, I gave it a coat of Vallejo flat, or matte flat, and now's the time where we start putting the cockpit together. Like any other Tamiya kit, especially the ones that have come out in the last few years, the fit is unbelievably good. It goes in like butter. It takes you no time at all to get this thing together. There will be no gaps. It'll all fit together like a Swiss watch. So it's actually a lot of fun once all the components are done to just slap them in there with a little bit of glue. You'll also notice that unlike most jet kits, I think, the ejection seats don't come until later in the build. So I'll get to them in a later video. I'm just going to do these videos as a sequence of build following the directions of the Tamiya kit. All right, so after the cockpit's done, you have to do the nose gear section because the cockpit sits on top of it. The white that I used is Tamiya X-2, the gloss white. I use that on every single one of the components to the gear bay. I then used I used Mig Ammo's panel line wash black for the wash inside of this component. And any mistake that I had in terms of it, a little bit too much wash here or there, was dealt with a Q-tip, and in some cases with a small paintbrush dipped in thinner. So that didn't take too much time at all. The rest of the components, I just followed the Tamiya instructions. It's very simple in terms of what colors to paint where. And again, once it's all painted, I put a flat coat on it. And then the assembly part is, again, just like the cockpit. It's like a Swiss watch. Everything fits absolutely perfectly. No worries at all. So once the nose gearbox is mounted beneath the cockpit, the last bit is to enclose it in the front nose section of the airplane. So there are just a few components that you have to glue in place. One of them is it's the refueling receptacle. You can either open that up or close it. In this case, I chose to close it. And on the other side of the cockpit, there is the part for I guess it's the cannon cover. and you just have to install that in place. What's amazing about these two components is once they're glued, like you put the glue in the right spot, a little bit of pressure, the panel line that's created is absolutely perfect. It's like it was molded like that. I find that things like that are quite fascinating, because in older kits, it definitely does not work that way. Once this stuff is all glued into place, you then have that moment of truth where you add the cockpit into the side of the fuselage, and you press the two fuselage halves together. So before I did that again, a mixture of it's Nato black and gloss black on both sides of the cockpit where the instructions call out for black. I put the cockpit in, it's glued into place, and typically this is where aircraft builds can be a bit frustrating, is enclosing the cockpit in, but I can assure you that most definitely in this case of the Tamiya Tomcat, it went absolutely perfectly. So a couple spots of glue here and there, a line of glue around each one of the mating surfaces on both sides, and you squeeze it together and everything lined up, and there was not a single panel line to worry about at the end of this thing going together. So that about wraps things up to get the cockpit, the nose gear, and the front nose section of the Tamiya Tomcat together. This will take you steps 1 through 8. And the next video is going to focus on completing the body, or at least the main fuselage of the airplane. So I have to say, this cockpit was a lot of fun to do, and with some fairly easy out-of-box techniques, you can really make the detail of the sidewalls and the instrument panels pop. I hope you liked this video. If you did and you think that others might too, please like and subscribe, and until the next video, we'll see you again.